Right, what are we reviewing today? Oh, well, it's Dracula, the original 1931 classic. Something's missing. Whoa! We need some thunder. Fog. That's it. Yes! It's October, Halloween time, the greatest time of the year, when creatures rise from their graves and monsters prowl the night. And one of the most popular creatures of the night are vampires, undead supernatural fiends, with no reflection or soul, shapeshifters searching for human blood. No! I said vampires. That's better. Vampires have been represented in almost every form of media in one way or another. He's had a ton of different versions across movies, parodied in cartoons. He finds himself in comic books as a major villain in the Marvel Universe, for example. And he's even the main threat in one of my favorite game series of all time, Castlevania.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. But enough talk. How about you?
Even though the myths and stories of vampires didn't really start with Dracula, he's the reason we have that stereotypical vampire costume you see every year in Halloween stores. That all started right here in 1931's Dracula. And damn, this movie's almost 90 years old now. It is the oldest movie I've ever reviewed, hands down. And I absolutely love the Universal monsters, possibly my favorite group of characters of all time. Every time I think of Halloween and horror movies in general, it's always this bunch that pops up in my head. In an era where audiences were used to silent films, Dracula was one of the first sound horror movies. That's right, kids, in the early days of movies, speech was something that was new. It sounds weird now, but back then, that was the norm. Dracula is considered such a groundbreaking movie that it's even preserved in the US National Film Registry as being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. Looking into the history of how this movie all came together is actually really interesting too, because there's a lot of misconceptions about where the Dracula story came from. The movie was based off a 1924 stage play, which in turn was based off of a novel written by Bram Stoker called Dracula. And over time, this myth came about that the novel's Dracula was based from the real-life Vlad the Impaler. This origin story for Dracula has been adopted into so many Dracula stories, but that's not even true. The real story is way more entertaining. Bram Stoker's own son said that his father got the idea for the novel from a nightmarish dream he had after eating too much crab. So think about that. One of the most culturally important movies of all time came from a novel written by a guy that had a nightmare because he had bad seafood. You know, I really don't like seafood, but maybe I should try some. If I eat some, if it's bad enough, maybe I'll have some really creative ideas for this channel. In fact, Bram Stoker chose the name Dracula simply because it means devil in Wallachian, or Wallachian, not sure if I pronounced it right. But I will wait patiently for the inevitable, outraged YouTube comment correcting me. Anyways, that's enough origin story. Let's see why this movie is so awesome. Right when Dracula opens up, it immediately tries to create a sense of fear, with some tropes that would be used time and time again through the decades. We've got Renfield, a man who's meeting Count Dracula on business, and he's warned to turn back. You do not want to come here. A vampire lord lives here. We are all terrified of him. Don't go. The locals even call that night the Night of Evil, and warn Redfield to stay away from Dracula's castle.
This night, the Night of Evil, Nosferatu.
There might be countless movies now where locals are aware of some kind of threat in the area, warning the main characters to stay away. Back in the days of Dracula, this was fairly original. Even Super Mario makes a cameo, urging Renfield to at least wait until sunrise the next day before leaving.
Castle Dracula?
Yes, that's where I'm going.
To the castle.
Yes.
Oh, no!
Ah, mamma mia.
But like you'd expect from any horror movie, Renfield decides to ignore the pleas of the villagers, and off he goes to Castle Dracula, with Dracula secretly posing as his driver. And then we get our first real look at Dracula and his brides, as Renfield encounters all sorts of craziness when he meets the Dark Lord. There's a spooky cavern, all kinds of critters moving about as vampires come out of their coffins. And armadillos, I'm not exactly sure why they chose armadillos. I've never attributed them to creepy Halloween stuff. I actually just had one in my backyard last week. They're not scary at all. But this whole scene looks like something right out of Goosebumps book. It makes the movie so much more haunting. It's the silence. That silence as the brides slowly move in towards the camera. If this movie had some kind of orchestral epic soundtrack, it wouldn't be the same. I don't know if it would work as effectively. In fact, most of the movie's very quiet and very heavy on dialogue, focusing on the performances of his actors and creating these iconic scenes that are instantly recognizable. Modern audiences might not consider this scary, but back in the 30s, newspapers reported cases of audience members fainting in shock while watching this movie. That's awesome. And it was actually really expensive adding an original musical score back then, so they used a portion of Swan Lake in the opening credits. The only music you hear in the entire movie, which happened to also be reused again for 1932's The Mummy. And Dracula himself, the star of the show, Bela Lugosi. I cannot express how amazingly perfect he is in his role. His appearance, his mannerisms, his actual Hungarian accent, his dialogue, all these things have become staples of the Dracula character. Nobody plays Dracula as good or as classically as Lugosi.
Excellent, Mr. Renfield. Excellent. I bid you welcome. Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make. Aren't you drinking? I never drink. Why?
When Renfield and Dracula meet for the first time, Dracula's signing a lease to get a property in London that he's moving to. I guess he got bored of living in a castle for centuries. And here Dracula showcases some of his powers. His most prominent being his power of persuasion, able to stare at people and force them to obey. And this is where the use of lighting works perfectly for this movie. Something that just wouldn't have been effective in color. Anytime he uses these powers, the film highlights his eyes, and it's actually kind of hilarious after a while because he does it so much in this movie. Montage. This is such a convenient power to have, and it seems to be his favorite to use. If I had this power, I would be using it all the damn time. Subscribe, like, share my videos, join my Patreon, obey. He also displays some other powers like turning into a bat, And they also mention at some points that he turns into some kind of wolf monster, but we never actually see it, which is one small complaint I do have about this movie. There's so much stuff that happens, but we only hear about it and don't see it. But Dracula isn't just super powerful, he also has some super powerful weaknesses. He cowers in fear at the sight of a cross. He's sensitive to an herb called wolfsbane, and he hates his own reflection, although others can't see it.
Look.
So Dracula and Renfield make this deal to lease this property in London, and Dracula takes a ship to get there. And fun fact here, all these shots of crew members struggling in the storm weren't even filmed for this movie. Universal just copy and pasted these scenes from another Universal movie called The Stormbreaker. By this time, Dracula's driven Renfield crazy, putting him under his control. And what happens when you're controlling a ship with Dracula on board and his insane slave?
Captain dead, tied to the wheel. Horrible tragedy, horrible tragedy.
Master, we are here.
And Renfield is almost as iconic in this movie as Dracula himself. You really believe this dude has gone completely nuts, and his laugh used to scare the hell out of me.
Why, he's mad. Look at his eyes. Why, the man's gone crazy.
He goes so crazy that he ends up in an insane asylum eating bugs and thinking that he needs blood to sustain himself.
Martin, don't throw my spider away from me. Oh, Martin. Who wants to eat flies?
You do, ya loony.
Not when I can get nice fat spiders.
Once Dracula gets to London, he immediately starts causing trouble. I mean, the guy has to eat, so he finds a woman on the street selling flowers, and all he sees is dinner. From this point on, the rest of the movie becomes sort of a mystery movie, with someone getting bit every once in a while, and then Van Helsing figuring out that Dracula is indeed a vampire and trying to convince everyone else of this. He's that typical character that knows the truth about the crazy events going on, and nobody else believes him. And he uses his intelligence to act as Dracula's nemesis. When these two are on screen together, it's a true battle of wits as Dracula tries to mind control him, and Van Helsing just resists.
Come here. Come here.
And that scene actually lasted just a little bit too long. Dracula also becomes obsessed with this lady called Mina, who's betrothed to Jonathan Harker, biting her also and putting her under his influence. So the last chapter of the movie becomes this race against time to kill Dracula before she becomes his slave forever. And it kind of seemed like they hit the fast forward button here. I don't know if they did this for running time purposes, since movies back then typically were pretty short, under an hour and a half. Now that would be considered a really short movie. Dracula takes her away, so Harker and Van Helsing rush over to find and destroy him. And Dracula is so outraged with Renfield failing him constantly that Dracula just annihilates him. Even though there's no violence or gore, I feel it's so brutal because of how he screams in pure terror. And also Renfield looks like an enemy from GoldenEye that you just killed as he flops around.
Don't kill me. Let me live, please. Punish me, torture me, but let me live. I can't die with all those lives on my conscience, all that blood on my hands. Ah! Ah!
And this is where what I call the fast forward effect hits full swing. I think they could have handled the ending a bit better, but these kind of sudden endings, they were typical of the time, so I can't complain too much. 1 second Dracula was walking around, then a split second later, he's sleeping in his coffin. It's kind of like when you're a kid and you're supposed to be in bed and you hear your parents coming, so you run over to your bed real quick and jump in pretending to be asleep. That's what Dracula just did here. Van Helsing and Harker, they find something to stake Dracula's heart and use it to kill him, all completely off camera.
Mina!
Come on, I wanted to see that happen, but realistically, had they done that back then, this movie would have been censored to hell. And then Harker is walking with Mina. The end. It's such a sudden ending. Here's my slightly improved version. As much as I love these old black and white classics, Dracula is a hard movie for me to recommend for one reason. Modern audiences, I don't know if they can really appreciate it. You have to be either a classic horror movie buff or just a movie buff in general to really understand what this movie accomplished and to be able to sit there and enjoy a movie that's got so much dialogue and silence versus action and an epic soundtrack. It might not be for everybody, but it sure as hell fits my definition of a classic. If you're even slightly interested in this movie, you should pick this up, the Universal Classic Monsters Collection on Blu-ray. And it's got all these classic monster movies. If you enjoyed this video, leave me a like and a comment down below letting me know. Don't forget to subscribe and follow me on social media. You can also check out some of my other videos or click my Patreon link if you'd like to support GamerThumbTV. This is Fabian. I love you guys, and I'll see you next time.